Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, As Told by Gabby. I'm Gabby, and today we are going to be talking about housing in Spain. I've gotten a few requests on this video or questions like how do you find housing once you arrive, where do you live, does your program help you? So I thought I'd just make a video answering those questions because these are the questions that I had that I remember watching YouTube videos and trying to find information for, so let's get into it. Housing in Spain. I'm not even gonna lie to you, it's not that easy, especially when you live in larger cities like Madrid, but don't let that discourage you. So I'm just gonna give you some steps that you need to help you find housing. So first and foremost, you need to wait until you have your carta before you can look for housing. Your carta is basically your contract for the program, telling you your school location, the name of your school, where you're gonna be. Specifically for the ministry, you can apply to any region you want. That doesn't mean you're gonna get it. And even within those regions, not everyone is placed in the larger cities. Like sometimes you're placed in pueblos, and sometimes you have to live in that pueblo because there's no transportation options. So you need to know exactly where your school location is before you can start looking for housing. So for example, for me, I applied to the program in March or April of 2019. I was accepted into my regional placement in, I want to say June, but I didn't have my carta or my contract until July. So I waited until July before I started putting plans into motion as far as plane tickets and as far as where I wanted to live. Speaking specifically to the NALCAP program, because that's what I know, the North American Language and Culture Assistance Program, if you're coming through Beta or through CIEE, I can't, or Medeas even, I can't really speak to that because that wasn't my experience. I know specifically with my program, we had to find housing on our own. It was our job to secure housing and to be at our school by the assigned date. So starting with my experience, my first year I was placed in Alicante, and I got really lucky. I was placed in Alicante City. Like on my contract, it says Alicante City. So that really made my search a bit easier because within the Alicante province, there are several cities and pueblos. Like there's Elda, there's Petrer, there's just like smaller cities on the outside of Alicante. A lot of people who work in those places live in Alicante or they live in Elche, which are larger cities within the province, and then they commute to those schools. That's not always an option. If there are no buses, if there are no trains, if you don't have teachers that are willing to carpool with you or other people that are willing to carpool with you, you may have to live within that pueblo or within that city. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a really good way to learn the language. It's a really good way to fully immerse yourself in the culture. I personally think that if I had been working in one of those smaller cities, I would have tried to live in Alicante and then commute to those schools. And the same thing when I was living in Madrid. I was placed in the Madrid region, but my school was placed a little bit outside of the city center of Madrid. So I commuted to school on the bus. I took a metro to the bus station and then I took a bus to my school. So door to door, it was about an hour of commuting, which wasn't bad. I wasn't that far out of the city. Like there are some people who do 2-hour commutes, hour and a half commute. And that's another thing. Just because there is a commute option, like think about, is it worth your time? Because typically we work about 16 hours a week, 4 hours a day. If you're spending 4 hours a day commuting, like round trip 4 hours, 2 hours there, 2 hours back, is it really worth your time or worth your money? Also money, because those commutes cost money. Is it worth it to live in the city versus living in the pueblo where you work? Personally for me, I would still live in the city, but some people, it would be more worth a better use of their time to just live in the pueblo that they're working in. But honestly, that is a personal choice that you have to make. They do ask on the application, would you like to work in a larger city, a medium city, or a small city? But that doesn't mean it's always taken into account. I was lucky all 3 times that I've been placed here, that I've always been placed in larger cities or at least in a commutable distance that made sense. But I've met some people who have had to live in the pueblos where they worked, or some people who chose to live in the pueblos where they worked because they wanted a more authentic experience. I know people who've had an hour commute, a 10-minute commute, a 2-hour commute. It really just depends. And another thing you have to factor in is when you are commuting, I don't know about you guys, but I'm from like a major city in the US. So like there are lots of transportation options, and every hour there are options. That's not always the case here. Sometimes there might be 2 or 3 buses a day. So say your school starts at 9 a.m. There's a bus at maybe 6 a.m. and there's not another bus until 11 a.m. You have to take that 6 a.m. bus in order to be at school on time. So it's something else that you have to factor in. I have a friend who finishes her workday at 1 p.m., but the next bus isn't until 3. So she waits around for those 2 hours until that bus comes, and then she has an hour commute ahead of her. So these are all things that you should think about when selecting your location. If you do decide that you want to live outside of the city where you work, definitely reach out to the teachers at your school, because there's a huge possibility that there are some teachers who are also doing the same, and they might be willing to carpool with you. Ask them for bus options, ask them for train options. They're locals and they know best what options you might have for where you can live. So as far as finding the apartment itself, I know that the program actually recommends that you even talk to your director and your tutora, the people you work directly with, basically your supervisors, for housing options. A lot of the schools have had auxiliaries before, and they can give you recommendations or even put you in contact with those auxiliaries who can help you find housing. Like maybe if you want to live where they lived, you can do that. There are apps such as Idealista, Badi, there are Facebook groups. I personally am a fan of Idealista. You can go on and put what neighborhood you want to live in, what city you want to live in. You can put the qualifications that you want, like do you want to live with 3 people? Do you want to live with 4 people? Do you want a furnished apartment? Do you want an unfurnished apartment? Do you want heating? Do you want an elevator? You can put all of these things in and filter the searches so that you can find somewhere to live. I found housing through Idealista twice, through Badi once, and I've also viewed and done tours through Facebook groups. It's also good to just like make friends and tell friends like, hey, I'm looking for housing here, I'm looking for housing there, because a lot of times people do through word of mouth as well. So that's also an option. If you guys notice that I keep looking down, it's because I have my notebook. So I took notes because I want to make sure I get everything in there for you guys. So as far as when you're scrolling on the apps, scan and favorite them, but I personally wouldn't contact them until you get closer to your arrival date. So like I said, I found out where I would be I found out my school location in July, but I knew I wasn't going to be leaving and moving to Spain until September. So throughout those few months, I would favorite and like kind of filter through the places that I was interested in, and then I waited until maybe a week before my arrival before I contacted those people, because the housing market in Spain moves very, very quickly as far as renting. So some place that you saw on Idealista the day before, it might be gone the next day. So it didn't really make sense to me to reach out to them if I wasn't moving there soon enough. And another thing, I personally do not recommend sending anyone any type of money until you have physically seen the place or you have someone there who can vouch for you. There are a lot of scams out there. There are a lot of people who might cheat you out of your money, and I feel like the safest option is to be physically there, be physically present, have the keys in your hand, a contract written out before you hand someone your money, because you won't be able to get it back. Also, people can show you pictures, people can show you videos, but there's nothing like entering into a space and seeing it with your own eyes. What does it smell like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? What's the lighting like? What is the neighborhood like? What are the streets like? If you've never been to the city that you're going to work in, you won't know any of these things. So I think it's really important that you physically go, or you have someone that you know and trust physically go and test things out for you. Also, your relationship with the landlord is very important as well. What are the vibes? Like, is it someone that you feel like you can trust? Do you feel like they're gonna scam you? Is there a language barrier? Like, what are the things that you're facing? I feel like these are all things that you need to do in person. I will say that finding housing was the most difficult when I was living in Madrid specifically, which I knew. I had read the Facebook posts, I'd read blogs, I had watched YouTube videos, and people have been warning me like housing in Madrid is really hard to find. It's very competitive, especially because there are a lot of Erasmus students, there are a lot of other expats. There are a lot of auxiliaries in Madrid as well, so things move very quickly. So for example, when I first moved to Spain my first year, I came to Spain a week before I was supposed to start working, which wasn't really enough time. Looking back on it, I wish I came earlier, but I was able to find housing before I started working because I was living in a smaller city. When I moved to Madrid, I moved there 2 or 3 weeks before I was meant to start school, because I knew it was going to be harder to find housing, and I knew I wanted to be secure and in a place and unpacked and everything before I started working to make my transition a lot easier. So it did take me 2 weeks, I believe, to find housing in Madrid. And both times that I was looking for housing, I stayed in an Airbnb. So my first year, when I moved to Spain, I didn't know anyone. Like, I had no friends, I had no family. I didn't even have acquaintances that were here. So there was absolutely no one I could have stayed with. So I stayed in an Airbnb for, I think I booked it for 5 days. And I stayed the full 5 days, but I found my housing in 4. So I was able to move directly into my housing from that Airbnb. And then for Madrid, I think I booked it for maybe like 7 to 10 days. I don't remember exactly how long I had that Airbnb for, but she was super cool. We are still friends. Honestly, your Airbnb hosts, they look out. Or the 2 that I've had very good Airbnb experiences in Spain. So I stayed with her for a while, and it got to the point where she even realized, she was like, wait, you've been looking for housing this whole time? And I was like, yeah. She's like, oh, you could have just lived with me. Girl, I already signed the contract. Like, you should have said something before, but she was cool. So book housing long enough to give yourself a leeway and padding to find somewhere to live. Looking back on it, I think I would have booked my Airbnb for Madrid for longer because I didn't end up liking where I was living. I think I settled because 1, I was tired of looking, and 2, my Airbnb was ending and she already had someone else that was coming in. So as far as the apps go, specifically with Idealista and Badi, agencies and private owners post on them. So when you work with an agency, typically they will charge you a month's rent in agency fees, and versus a private owner where that's just like the flat rate. I've done both. Personally, I would avoid agencies at all costs because maybe it's just the agencies that I've worked with, I don't feel like they do enough to warrant me paying them 300, 400 euros worth of a fee. That's just my personal experience, because in my experience, all they've done is put me in contact with the person. Especially if you're on Idealista and you're like, I want this house, you already know what you want, you're basically only paying them to get in contact with them. So I would recommend working with private owners just because you can save a month's worth of rent by working with private owners. But that's just my recommendation. I've done both, and I really think that it's just not worth the money. Unless you're like going to an agency and they're helping like scout out apartments for you, like they're physically finding apartments for you and you're not doing anything else, then maybe it's worth it. But like, I already knew what apartment I wanted. I just needed to get in contact with the owner, and I had to go through an agency. And I paid, when I went to the agency, my rent was $325. So I had to pay them $325 in rent, $325 deposit, and $325 in the first month's rent. So I shelled out all that money before I even moved in. It hurt me deeply. So that's my 2 cents about that. As far as communicating with the owners, I would say about 70% of the time, there's about a 70% chance that the owners are not going to speak English. And that goes for private agencies as well. So what you have to do if you don't speak Spanish, I highly recommend using Google Translate. You can message them in English, but in my experience, you're more likely to get a quicker response if you message them in Spanish. And even quicker if you physically call them. Another thing is, when you are searching through a lot of apartments, it can get a little bit confusing. So what I like to do when I'm messaging people through like WhatsApp, I would save their contact as the name of the street. So let's say the name of the street is like Calle Valencia or Calle Madrid. I would save the contact not as their name, not as the realtor's name, not as the owner's name. I would be like, say the owner's name is Maria Calle Madrid, or Maria Calle Valencia, so I would remember what house I was talking about. Because it's very easy to get confused, especially when you're apartment hunting in Madrid. When I went apartment hunting in Madrid, I would see like 5 or 6 pieces a day, and I'm trying to like catalog them. So I would try to keep notes on my phone about things I liked, things I didn't like about that apartment, and I would label it by the street so that if I didn't remember, I could just look up the pictures and look up the street and be like, okay, I'm talking about that apartment. I think that's a good way to help keep yourself organized while you're apartment hunting. So money, money, money. So typically when you're moving into a new place, they will ask you for first month's rent, a deposit. If you're working through an agency, they'll ask for an agency fee. Some places will ask you for 2 months deposit. I do not recommend doing that. I personally feel like that's a scam. Why do you need 2 months of deposit from me? And I don't recommend it because it can be difficult to get your deposit back sometimes for people. Like I've seen many stories. I personally have experienced this where my landlord, my first apartment, I didn't get my deposit back because I didn't stay through my contract length, but my deposit was 90 euros and I was willing to lose that money just because I didn't want to live there anymore. My second apartment, my deposit was $325. And I remember they both came. It was a husband and a wife. And they came and they toured the apartment when I was leaving. They made sure everything was fine. They looked at everything. They cleared me to move out. I get on my plane. I fly home for the summer. A few weeks go by. I'm messaging her. And suddenly she just sends me these paragraphs on paragraphs of things that are all wrong with the house. Meanwhile, she's sending me pictures of things that are broken that I did not break. What she wasn't banking on was me taking pictures of the house before I left. I had pictures. So she would send me a picture of a broken something, whatever, door or something, and I would send her a picture with a timestamp saying this door was not broken when I left. And then she completely ghosted me. Once I was able to prove that I hadn't broken or done anything, she completely ghosted me. I never got my deposit back. Looking back on it in hindsight, now that I've lived in Spain for 2 or 3 years, I know there are avenues that I could have taken. I could have reported her, I could have done all these other things, but she banked on me not knowing these things. Like, I was 22, 23 years old, I was young, I was an expat, I'd never lived here. I was already back in the US and I was going to be home for 2 months. Like, there was nothing I could have done really by that point, and she knew that. So my saving grace was that she only had 1 month's worth of rent versus 2, because I know it's becoming more common, specifically in Madrid, for them to ask for 2 months worth of rent. If you can, try and negotiate with them and be like, hey, can we just do 1? If they say no, unless you are really truly in love with that apartment, trust your landlord, and or are willing to lose that money in the end, then do it. But personally, I'm not giving anyone 2 months worth of deposit personally. And another thing I will say, as far as like landlords, there were no signs from me personally that she was going to do something like that to me. Like, previously we had a very good relationship. My roommate and I were renting the entire place. It was a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom place that we were both renting. I was the last one to move out, so I did all the cleaning and I took all the pictures. My roommate took care of her stuff before she left, but I ended up staying 2 or 3 weeks longer than her. I had to keep extending my flight because it was when we first got out of lockdown in COVID, and my flights kept getting canceled. So I would message her and be like, hey, is it okay if I stay for another week? I'll pay you, blah, blah, blah. Cool, everything was fine. She was very pleasant when she came to tour the place. She was always very present when I was interacting with her. So her cheating me out of my money really came out of left field. So it's like, as much as you trust someone, as much as you think that they're good vibes, they're good people, people are still people. She knew she could get away with cheating me, and she did. So I would say definitely look out for your best interest in it, because it is a business transaction at the end of the day. Honestly, I'm getting mad again thinking about it. Like, she really played me. This was like 2 years ago, and I'm rehashing it again, thinking about how this woman still owes me 325 euros, but let's move on. So usually they will expect all of this money up front before they give you the keys. Some people will do like bank transfers. Some people will ask for cash. I will say that if you do deal in cash, always get a receipt. Always have proof that you were supposed to be there. Make sure you have a written out contract with your name in it, with the owner's name in it, which these are all things that you need, because you need an empadronamiento in order to get your visa. So, and that's a whole other video, a whole other story, but like, you need a contract saying that you are supposed to live there, and you need proof that you are paying them. So make sure you always get receipts, and make sure you always have a contract. Also, trust your gut. If you're in the most beautiful apartment in the world, it's beautiful, it's pretty, it's cheap, it's in a great location, it's with great people, and something just feels off, run. If something feels wrong, I said this in other videos too regarding safety. In any situation, just trust your gut. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, so this is like a list of things that I think that you should look for and / ask about when you're looking for an apartment. So number 1, can you empadrone in that apartment? So empadrone or empadronamiento is basically you registering with the Spanish government or your local government, saying that you live at this address, and it's what they put on your ID when you get your visa. Some places or some landlords aren't willing to let you empadrone there, and but that is important information, because you need that in order to apply for your visa. So if you are not allowed to empadrone at that apartment, you cannot live there. So that is one of the most important questions to ask while you're touring or before you even tour the apartment, because you need it in order to stay in Spain. So make sure you ask your landlord or your agent or whatever, be like, hey, I am applying for a student visa, I need an empadronamiento, am I able to be listed on the empadrone for this apartment? Typically they will say yes, occasionally they will say no, but you have to ask. Also, utilities. Are the utilities included, or are they apart from the rent? And if they're apart from the rent, approximately how much are they? So you can get an idea of how much you're going to be paying a month. The first place that I lived at, I paid a flat fee of 250 euros for a room, and that included everything, utilities. The only time that we would have to pay more is if the utilities were like outrageous or something for a month. I don't really remember what the threshold was or the unit of measurement was for that, but that was also how it was when I lived in Madrid. I paid 550 for a room, and that was everything included, like heating, water, electric, Wi-Fi, everything was included. And the only time it would go up is if our electric was super high, but I only lived there for 3 or 4 months, and that never happened. So is it gas or is it electric? So I lived in 3 places that were gas. So the first place I lived in, the water was electric and the stove was gas. I never had any interaction with a gas stove before, so I was literally terrified of that stove for the first few weeks that I lived there. I did not use it for like 2 weeks, and I still wouldn't use it unless someone else was home, because you had to like use a lighter and like physically light it with, and like switch the knob like that. The second place we lived in, the water and the stove were gas, so we had to like replace it with tanks whenever it would run out. It would usually run out like every 2 or 3 months, but there's no warning. It's just like, just one day you're in cold water, or one day your like stove just like stops working. So in that case, I think the botellas, the bottles or the gallon thingies were like 18 euro. They're like 18 to 20 euros a thing, and you would replace them like every 2 to 3 months depending on how much you and the people living there use it. I think that gas is cheaper than electric, but electric is more convenient. To be honest, I don't really have a preference. Like, I won't not live somewhere just because it's electric or just because it's gas, just because at this point I've experienced both and been okay. But if you don't want to deal with having to replace the gas every few months, or just gas at all, and you just want to go for electric, that's something you should ask and consider when you're moving into places. Next thing, is it noisy? So I think the popular thing to do when you first move abroad, especially if you're young, fresh out of college like I was, you want to live in the center, you want to live in the middle of the action, but what you need to consider is how noisy is it? My first apartment, personally my room was not noisy because I lived in the interior room, but my roommate, his room was facing the street on one of the busiest streets that we were in the city. And it was very hard for him to go to sleep sometimes because people will be yelling or screaming or even just talking, because the walls are thin, the glass is thin, like you can hear whole conversations from his 4th floor window. So how noisy is it? And that's why I recommend that you go to places and physically stand in them and see them so that you can know. Our second place wasn't as noisy, only really on the weekends, but again, I had the interior room, so I wasn't aware of the noise. When I lived in Madrid, I also had the interior room, and we were very high up, so the only noise I heard was my roommates, and they were noisy AF. So also, one thing about interior rooms typically get less sunlight than the exterior rooms. That doesn't mean you won't have any sunlight. Like, all of my interior rooms still got decent amounts of sunlight, but they were significantly less than some of my roommates were getting. So that's also important to you. Is sunlight something that is super important to you, or is it just kind of whatever for you? Because typically the interior rooms are cheaper than the exterior rooms because of the sunlight. So that's why I also recommend going to see it during the day. Honestly, if you can, go see the apartment during the day and then maybe do a walk by at night, like a walkthrough, and just see what's what. Something else that I think is important to ask the roommates is, what is the roommate process selection like? So unless you were renting the entire apartment, I've done that twice. We are currently renting this entire apartment. Me and my roommate, we split the rent for this apartment. And then my second apartment that I lived in, me and my roommate rented the entire apartment, and we split the rent for that apartment as well. But when I lived in places with more rooms, like 4 or 5 rooms, I was only renting 1 room. So the landlord can pretty much put whoever they want in there. So maybe ask them like, hey, will we be able to decide who moves in, or is it just whoever gives you the money first? My first apartment, we had no say in who lived there. The landlord would just bring people by the tour. If they liked it, they would move in. And when I moved to Madrid, the apartment that I lived in, all of my roommates were already living there. I was the last person to move in, and they interviewed me. The landlord gave them autonomy in deciding who would live in that room. So it was, when they were interviewing me, it was between me and like 2 or 3 other people, and they decided to go with me after the interview because we vibed the best. So I think that's a good thing as well, when the landlord respects you enough to let you decide who lives there. And that landlord, listen, He was great because I signed, I think, a 9-month contract. 3 months in, I decided I didn't want to live there anymore, and he gave me my deposit back. He gave me my deposit back. Like, I'm sorry, but that's low-key unheard of. When you, not only did I leave before the end of my contract, he gave me no fuss about it. He was supposed to meet me to tour my room. Something came up. He was like, just send me a video, send me some pictures. I sent him the video, I sent him the pictures. He had, my deposit was back in my bank account the next day. So, listen, great guy. 10 out of 10. I think his name was Jose. Ugh, love him. Also with the roommate selections, it's important. Are your roommates Erasmus? Are they going to be there long term? Because some Erasmus students are only there, say, from like the end of the summer to Christmas or whatever. And then there's like another round of people coming in. So the people that you move in with may not necessarily be there through the end. Because as auxiliaries, our contract is from October till May in most regions, and October till the end of June in Madrid. So are the people I'm moving in with now going to be there for the entirety of my stay? So that's also something to factor in. It's also very important. You need to ask who is responsible for repairs. If something breaks in the apartment, is it my responsibility to fix it, or is it your responsibility to fix it? This is something that needs to be crystal clear before you move in. My first apartment, it was very old and it had a lot of problems. Like there was flooding, there was like problems with the sink, and our landlord covered all of those repairs because they weren't manufactured. Like we didn't do it. It wasn't our we didn't personally break anything. Things were breaking because they were old. So he covered it and didn't take it out of our deposit or anything like that. My second place, for the woman we've already discussed before, when we wrote out the contract and when we discussed it, she said that she would be responsible for repairs. If we broke it, we were responsible for it, but if it was like normal wear and tear, they would cover it, right? So the knob in my bathroom, and like I had a bathtub in my bathroom, it like stopped working. Like the shower head stopped working, and it wasn't because I broke it, it wasn't because I dropped it, it was just old. And I told her, I texted her, I said, hey, I need to get this fixed. Like, and she's like, okay, no problem, no pasa nada, I'll send a repairman. She sent the repairman out. He told me, yeah, it's just like normal wear and tear, like I'll just replace the head, no pasa nada, it's fine. He gave me the bill. It was like 10 or 15 euros. She told me, send me a picture of it, I'll pay for it, and she did. Everything was fine. When I'm moving out and trying to get my deposit back, she goes, oh no, I had to pay for the repairman, it cost this much, this much, this much. I said you would cover that. She's like, no, blah, blah, blah. She had to go back on her word. I tried to send her screenshots. Like we already established, she ghosted me. So this is something that you really need to take into account. The current place that I live in now, there was a problem with the like the heating air unit. And again, not something that we did, not something we broke, but our landlord covered it because it's like normal wear and tear. So, and also, who can you call when these things happen? Are you going to be calling the landlord? Some landlords are not Spanish. Like some of them are, they live in other countries and like they're renting out their vacation homes. So they have a middleman that lives in the city that you're in that handles everything. So am I contacting the middleman? Am I contacting the landlord? Do I have to find someone on my own and pay for it out of pocket? All questions you need to ask. Another thing, what is the heating / air situation? So in Madrid, it gets very hot in the summer. In Alicante, it gets very hot in the summer. And Madrid, it also gets very cold in the winter. So is there central heating? Are there air units? Are there things we plug into the wall? Like what does that look like? The first place I lived, we didn't have any central heating. Most of the places I've lived have not. I have never lived in an apartment that has had central heating in Spain, is what I'm noticing. It's not very common. So the first place I lived, I had like a wall unit, but it really only heated up that part of the room. So if I was cold, I would just go stand in that part of the room. And then my roommates didn't even have wall units. They had like the portable heaters that they would plug into the wall. But like we talked about before, my first apartment was very old. So if we plugged too many heaters in and then also just happened to be using the washer at the same time or the oven, the power would go out. There were 5 of us living there, so that happened quite often towards the end of my duration at this apartment. The next apartment I lived in, what did I have? I had a fan. There was no wall unit, there was no anything. We had fans, and I feel like that might not have been a cold winter because I don't remember having a heater either. I don't think I did. And then when I was in Madrid, I had like a wall unit in my room, but it was controlled by the building. So it was a community thing. So they decided when the heating got turned on. So I remember my roommate who lived there, she got cold really easily. So she was cold by like October. So I think she bought her own, or maybe she got one from the landlord. She had a wall heater unit until the building decided to turn on the heat. The only thing is when the building controls the heat, like if you're hot, you're just hot. Like you can't do anything about it. If you're cold, then you're just cold. You just have to wait until they decide to do what they want to do. This current place has a wall unit that you can use as a heater and you can also use as air. But my room was rather large, so it takes a little while for it to get warm. There are no heaters in the hallway and we have tile floors, so it is very cold in the winter, and we kind of just like run back and forth with our socks on to stay warm. But it's not cold here for very long, so it's okay. But if central heating is something that's important to you, like if you're someone that gets very, very cold, I would recommend central heating. It is, however, expensive, which is why it's not very common. So factor that in. So another thing you need to ask about our appliances: is there an oven? Is there a washer? Is there a dryer? Is there an elevator? I would say there's a 50-50 split on whether or not there's going to be an elevator. I've lived in 2 places that didn't have elevator. Two of the places I've lived in did not have elevators. 3 of them did. So I would say like it could go either way. Sometimes there's an elevator, sometimes there's not. An oven. I have lived in a place that did not have an oven. It's not as common as you would think to have an oven in your apartment. It's not a given. Most of the places I've lived have not had a dishwasher. I lived in 2 places that had a dishwasher, which was nice, but now I'm so accustomed to not having one. Like this current place does not have a dishwasher and I'm just used to it at this point. It's fine. And I think it's to save water. Water in Spain is pretty expensive, and that's why people don't typically have dishwashers, and the apartments are a bit older, which is why they don't have dishwashers as well. The 2 times I did have a dishwasher, they were both newer apartments and renovated apartments. Dryer. I have never had an in-home dryer. I've never had a dryer in any of the apartments I've lived in. There's always, not always, there's a washer, but not always a dryer. So you have to like line dry your clothes outside, or you can get like a rack that you can bring inside your home. We have both here. This place didn't come with a washer just because it used to be an Airbnb and it just wasn't, I guess, important to the owners to have a washer. So my roommate and I bought a secondhand washer. I think we paid 75 euros for it. And like, that's my asset now. Like I have a washer. I would say elevators can be important. I will say the first place I lived was on the 4th floor. Technically 5th, because like they counted the 1st floor as 0. So you walk upstairs, that's 0. You walk up some more stairs, that's 1. That's when they started counting. There was no elevator, and you know what? Moving in and moving out of that apartment, moving out wasn't as bad. Moving in was like probably one of the worst experiences I've had in Spain. Just because like I said, I didn't know anyone, I didn't have any help. I was on my own, moving all of my things up 4 flights of stairs. And I went out the night before. I wasn't hungover, but I low-key was still drunk when I woke up, and it just was not a fun experience. Like, and I was on a time crunch because I had to be out of my Airbnb by 11 a.m. It was just, I had to go through the city because I don't know. I don't know why I didn't just like call a taxi or a Cabify or something like that. Cabify is what they have instead of Uber. I don't know where my logic was, but I was like carrying all this stuff on my own through the city. It was like a 10-15 minute walk, which is fine if you're not lugging 50-pound bags. So yeah, I would say elevators are nice and helpful, but they're not necessarily a necessity, but it is something to think about every time you have groceries, or sometimes you just don't feel like walking up 4 flights of stairs. But I made it work, but I did make sure that the next place I lived had an elevator. The other time I didn't have an elevator, I was living on the 2nd floor, so it wasn't that deep. But if an elevator is important to you, maybe put that in your filters. Also, proximity to your transportation. When I lived in Madrid, I knew that I was going to have to commute to my school, so I knew I needed to live somewhat close to public transportation. And my place was literally the metro. I could see the metro from my building door, so that was really nice because I am a last minute person. I'm not a morning person, so I'm usually running around trying to make it to school on time. Yeah, so my metro station was literally right outside my door. And then here I have to walk maybe like less than 10 minutes to get to my metro. But yeah, make sure you're close to your transportation. I had a friend, she lived a little bit outside of the city center our first year, but her commute was 2 hours, but she also had to walk 25 minutes to get to the bus station before she even started her 2-hour commute. That's something that you should think about. So I think in hindsight, she would have lived closer to the bus station, but I think she was just like so in love with the apartment that she was willing to do that walk every day. I think I would have tried to live closer to the bus station personally, but her terrace was sick though. Like, her terrace was really nice. Like, I see why she did what she did. Also, if a terrace is important to you, definitely look for that, because some terraces have really amazing views. Furniture. So I recommend finding a place that's furnished, especially if you don't know how long you plan on being in Spain. I had only planned to be here for a year originally, so I was like, I might have to buy furniture. Also, where do I buy furniture? Also, I don't even know the words for furniture in Spanish. So I always recommend looking for places that are already furnished. There are a lot of them that are already furnished. That way you don't have to move furniture and your things when you do eventually move out. You can filter that in your searches in Badi and in Idealista. Most of the Facebook groups, there are other auxiliaries posting those apartments, so they typically are furnished as well. What else? Neighborhood safety. Definitely research the neighborhoods that you're going to choose to live in. Like I said before, do a walk by during the day, do a walk by at night, and do your due diligence. There are, especially when you're in a larger city or a larger place, there are some neighborhoods that maybe aren't as safe as others. They maybe aren't as well lit as others. If you're living in the middle of like the clubs and the bars and things like that, you're probably going to encounter a lot of drunk people on a regular basis if you're living right next to a bar or right next to the bar scene. It's probably going to be very loud. It's probably going to smell a little bit because people just pee on the street here. Like, it's not that uncommon. So if you don't want to live in that situation, I would recommend living a little bit outside of the center, but still walkable. Yeah, so definitely be aware of your neighborhood. Ask around who your neighbors going to be. Are your neighbors loud? Are your neighbors young? Are your neighbors old? If you want to be throwing parties in your apartment, maybe don't live in a building or a neighborhood where there is a large population of older people, because they are not going to be with it. They are not going to support it. They will call the police. So that's something to think about. If you want something that's more quiet, maybe don't live with a lot of younger people, a lot of people who are of like the partying age or of the partying variety. If you want like a more calm, quiet experience. If it's hard for you to sleep with lots of noise, maybe don't live by a major street. Common spaces. So if you're living with 3, 4, or even 5 people like I have before, what do the common areas look like? When I lived in Madrid, it was a 7-bedroom apartment, but only 5 people lived there. But we had 2 refrigerators because we needed them. If you have more than 3 people living there, more than like 4 people living there, I would recommend searching for places that have more than 1 refrigerator, because you're gonna run out of space. You're gonna get full. Because even when there are 5 of us and we had 2 refrigerators, both of those refrigerators were packed. And we would allot space, like this is my shelf, this is their shelf, this is your shelf, mainly because we didn't really know each other. Like, we weren't like friends like that. We weren't sharing food, even though some people apparently thought we were, because I would come home and some things would be missing. So it's also a conversation you need to have with your roommates. Like, are we sharing food or are we not sharing food? We need to establish boundaries. Like, if you would like to borrow something, please ask, things like that. Bathrooms. I also had my own bathroom when I was living in that apartment, so I didn't really have to deal with this as much. But all the girls were sharing one bathroom and all the guys were sharing one bathroom. It caused a lot of conflict in our apartment because some people were cleaner than others and some were less clean than others. So definitely look into that as well too. Like, what are your cleaning habits? What are my cleaning habits? Can we develop some type of schedule? What are the expectations? And then also storage. That apartment had a lot of storage rooms where we would put our suitcases and things like that. Are you gonna have to leave your suitcase in your room, or are you gonna have to leave it in the common area? Like, what does that look like? Something to think about. Okay, and last but not least, decide who you wanna live with. Do you wanna live with English speakers, or do you wanna live with Spanish speakers? Do you want like a more international feel? If you're in a larger city, it's potential you could live with French people, you could live with Spanish people, you could live with Russian people, you could live with American people, Australian, like people from all walks of life, people from all different cultures, which I think is a really cool experience. I've lived in those experiences 2 different times where everyone that lived there was from somewhere else. There was always at least one other English speaking person there, which I also, for me personally, was really important, because I know in the beginning I was a little bit homesick just because I was overwhelmed. I didn't know anyone. I was here by myself. I didn't felt like I had anyone to talk to. I wasn't very comfortable speaking Spanish yet. Like I could interact and I could understand, but I wasn't at the level where I was comfortable expressing emotion or expressing feeling, and I didn't have that relationship with people yet. So for me, it was important to have at least one other English speaker in the house, but it's also really nice to have other languages in the house as well, because my Spanish got really good once I started living with people who didn't speak English. I was forced to interact with them, pushed me out of my comfort zone, and knowing that like if I want to speak to this person, I have to speak in Spanish. Or for some places, like Spanish is the only common language. For example, I have some friends that were Italian and I'm American. They don't speak English, I don't speak Italian. The only language we both speak is Spanish. So that's a really good way to get really good language skills really quickly. But yeah, I hope this video helped. I know it's a little bit more serious. Well, I'm just trying to like prepare you guys for what you could be walking into. If you have any more questions or want more clarification on something, definitely leave your questions in the description box. I hope this was helpful. I would like to reiterate that this is my experience and just like information that I've gathered from living here for the past 2.5, almost 3 years. Other people might have different experiences. But yeah, I hope this was helpful. I can do a part 2 if I didn't answer anything. I really tried to think of all the questions that I had, / would have had, / do have, / could have. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what else you want to see, and good luck finding housing. Bye.